Hi, we're reading Full Color Captain Underpants and the Tyrannical Retaliation of the Turbo Toilet 2000 by Dav Pilkey. We left off on Chapter 6. Chapter 6, Sanitized for Your Protection. Unfortunately, the epic fight that followed was way too violent and disturbing to appear in a children's book. The images and descriptions would just be too terrifying. You'd have nightmares for weeks. Trust me. So I have invited a guest illustrator, Timmy Swanson, age 4, to draw the action in a style that won't depict too much graphic detail. I've also asked his Nana, Gertrude, age 71, to describe the scene in her own gentle vocabulary. Take it away, Timmy and Nana. Today's special guests, Nana and Timmy. Thank you, dear. Well, let's see what's happening here. What? Oh my, that's horrible. It looks like a little boy is, oh dear. Now what's he doing? Oh dear me. This certainly is not appropriate at all. And now there's a robot shaped like, well, I'd rather not say. He's just doing such dreadful things though. And oh my. Say, what kind of book is this? Oh, for heaven's sake, this is ridiculous. I've never been so offended in all my, I've seen just about enough. Oh dear. Timmy, stop drawing. Stop drawing this instant. No, Timmy, no. Chapter 7, the incredibly graphic violence chapter, Part 1 in Flip-O-Rama, featuring Nana and Timmy. Introducing Flip-O-Rama, Pilkey brand. I've had enough of this insanity. Shame on you all. It's okay, Nana. Just a few more flip pages and it'll all be over. Oh dear! Oh dear! Ah! Oh my! Oh my! Oh, for goodness sake. Chapter 8, Everybody Loves Melvin. When it was all over, the Turbo Toilet 2000 was dead, and Melvin Sneedly was a hero. The mayor had a big parade in honor of Melvin. Weird Al Yankovic wrote a song about him. Even the vice president sent a letter of congratulations. Melvin Sneedly was known throughout the world as the little super-powered tattletale who saved the world. Finally, said Melvin, I'm getting the respect I deserve. Hooray for Melvin. We love Melvin. Melvin forever. Dear Melvin, dude, you totally rock. Oh my God. Your pal, Vice President of the United States. Tattletales rule. We're so immature. Chapter 9. With great power comes a great big pain in the hiney. Melvin enjoyed being a superhero at first. It was fun stopping runaway trains, rescuing lost children, and saving people from burning buildings. Whenever anybody needed help, All they had to do was lift their heads to the sky and cry out, "Yo, Big Melvin!" And Big Melvin would drop whatever he was doing and zip to the scene to save the day. It was all good at first, until it started to get bad. You see, after a while, people started to abuse the system. They started crying out, "Yo, Big Melvin!" all the time, and it got old pretty quickly. Melvin would drop everything, throw on his cape, fly out the window, zip through the city, and arrive at the scene, only to find out that it wasn't an emergency at all. Usually it was just someone who had misplaced her cell phone, or a kid who needed help with a video game cheat code, or some guy who had accidentally dropped his wallet in the toilet. It was a complete waste of Melvin's time, and the interruptions were beginning to drive him crazy. But the final straw came one evening as Melvin was doing a synchrotron radiation experiment with his homemade oscillating field particle accelerator. 11 months of research were finally about to pay off. The klystrons and electromagnets began to accelerate the hadrons faster and faster through Melvin's homemade copper cyclone tubing. Soon Melvin would be the first person on Earth to definitively prove the Higgs boson's existence and solve the mystery of everything. But then, with his supersonic eardrums, Melvin heard a cry for help from across the city. Quickly, Melvin shut down his experiment, which caused the particle accelerator to overheat. The resulting explosion blew a hole in his bedroom floor 40 feet deep. But Melvin didn't care. Somewhere in the city, a citizen needed his help. So he grabbed his smoldering cape from the pile of ashes that used to be his bedroom closet and flew to the scene of the emergency. When he arrived, he found a middle-aged woman screaming frantically out her apartment window. "Yo, Big Melvin! Help! Help! It's an emergency!" "What's wrong?" asked Melvin desperately. "Do these pants make me look fat?" asked the lady. Chapter 10. It's a mad, mad, mad Melvin. Melvin was angry. Very, very angry. Since he'd become a superhero, he'd had no time to do his experiments. He'd had no time off, no sleep, no privacy, no time for anything. At that moment, Melvin made a decision. He decided, for his own sanity, to quit the superhero business once and for all. But getting out was going to be a lot harder than it was getting in. Melvin needed to find a superhero to replace him. So he made up his mind to locate Captain Underpants and bring him back to Pequot and let him deal with all the hassles of superhero-dom. Finding Captain Underpants, it turns out, wasn't as hard as Melvin had expected. Melvin knew that George and Harold were usually with Captain Underpants, and Sulu the bionic hamster was usually with George and Harold. "So," Melvin concluded, "if I find Sulu, I should find Captain Underpants." Since Melvin had installed a GPS on Sulu's robotic endoskeleton, all Melvin had to do was run a simple scan on his computer for the GPS device. At first, the scan found nothing, so Melvin broadened his search to include all locations and all times. Finally, Melvin's search paid off. He found Sulu's last satellite reported location down by the schoolyard, 29 years in the future. That wasn't too hard, Melvin sneered, but bringing them all back to the present will be a little more complicated. Chapter 11, Dark Foreshadows. Melvin went to his garage and climbed into his glow-in-the-dark, time-traveling robo-squid suit. Quickly, the suit powered up and started slinking and slithering toward the schoolyard as Melvin began the long journey to bring George, Harold, and Captain Underpants back home where they belonged. After solving some surveillance photo issues at the bank, Melvin zapped himself to the future, fetched everyone, and brought them all back 1 year earlier to the exact time and place where they had departed on their journey in our last book. George, Harold, and Captain Underpants had been through a lot in the past few days, but now it was as if they had never left at all. Everything was just as it had been. The Turbo Toilet 2000 wouldn't arrive on Earth for another 2 weeks, so Melvin's future as a superhero would never become reality, and nobody was happier about that than Melvin himself. I don't have to be a superhero anymore, cried Melvin happily. I can finally follow my destiny. Peace and quiet at last. But you still haven't told us why you've brought us back, said George. Yeah, said Harold. What gives? Oh, you'll find out, said Melvin with a foreboding chuckle. Ha ha ha. In 2 weeks, you'll find out. Melvin unleashed a horrible, villainous laugh as his glow-in-the-dark robo-squid suit began to shake and buzz. Soon he and his tentacled time machine disappeared into a ball of electric light. Chapter 12, Headin' Home. George and Harold had no choice but to take Mr. Krupp home. They brought him to his front door, got the key out from behind the bushes, and let him in. Go over to the kitchen sink and splash some water on your face, said George. Aye, aye, sir, said Captain Underpants. He did as he was told, and in no time at all, he was back to his grumpy old self. No salesman, keep off the do not smell flowers, private property. I wonder what's going to happen in 2 weeks, said Harold as he and George walked home. Ah, I'm sure it's no big deal, said George. If Melvin can handle it, we can handle it. Soon George and Harold were back up in their treehouse. Carefully they placed Cracker's eggs on some soft pillows under a few desk lamps. There, said George, that should keep them warm and cozy. George and Harold were dead tired. They hadn't slept in over 30 hours, and they'd been running for their lives most of that time. I need a serious nap, said Harold as he settled into his beanbag chair. Me too, said George as he collapsed into his own beanbag chair. Saving the world is exhausting. I'm still a little worried about that whole 2 weeks thing, said Harold. That sounds really bad. Relax, said George. There's nothing we can do about it now anyway. Let's try to stay out of trouble for the next 2 weeks, said Harold. If the world is going to end, I don't want to be stuck in detention the whole time. Ah, don't worry so much, said George. Besides, how much trouble could we get into in 2 weeks anyway? Chapter 13, 11 minutes later. George! Harold! Get down here right now! George and Harold opened their eyes. Wearily, they stumbled to the treehouse door and looked down. George's mom and dad and Harold's mom were all standing down in the yard looking very angry. "The school called," George's dad said. "They told us that you kids weren't in class today." "Uh-oh," said George. "We're dead," said Harold. "Would you mind explaining what you've been doing all day?" asked Harold's mom angrily. George and Harold could hide the truth no longer. They decided to confess everything. "We couldn't go to school today," said George. "We had to save the earth from an evil, crazy guy who was riding around in a giant pair of robotic pants." "Yeah," said Harold. "We've spent the last day traveling through time, running from dinosaurs and teaching cavemen how to defend themselves." "Very funny," shouted George's dad. "If you kids think you can skip school and goof around all day, you're in for a big surprise." George and Harold had never seen their parents so angry. The two boys spent the next 5 hours mowing lawns, weeding gardens, vacuuming houses, washing cars, dusting furniture, cleaning out garages, whitewashing fences, doing dishes, folding laundry, and taking out garbage. It was exhausting work, but it was nothing compared to what was to come next. Guys, if you haven't, I'd love for you to subscribe to my channel at Roz Reads. Chapter 14, What Was to Come Next? George and Harold had never been so tired in all their lives. At 9:30 p.m., they grunted "good night" to each other and limped to their houses like zombies. "Would you like a snack, dear?" said Harold's mother. "No, thanks," he mumbled. He was too tired for a snack, too tired to take a bath, too tired to put his pajamas on or take his shoes off. He didn't even have the energy to turn out his bedroom light. He just collapsed on top of his bed and fell asleep instantly. Harold's lair. 22 seconds later, the telephone rang. It was George. Harold's mother brought the phone into his room and held it up to his ear. Harold was too tired to even say hello. He just mumbled, "Oomph." "I just remembered something," said George, panicking. "Tomorrow is test day." Harold's bloodshot eyes popped open and he sat up straight. "Oh no!" Harold cried. "I forgot all about that." "Me too," said George. "We're having major tests in all of our classes tomorrow. We're going to have to stay up all night long and study." Chapter 15, To Thine Own Self Be Truant. When the sun rose the next day, George and Harold were still going through their spelling checklists. George was almost done studying. Harold still had to read 44 pages of his natural history textbook. "Breakfast is ready," shouted George's dad from downstairs. George stumbled down exhaustedly and tried to smush some waffles into his mouth. He missed. Meanwhile, Harold was sitting at his breakfast table in a burnt-out stupor, buttering his cereal and pouring milk on his toast. "Did you get any sleep at all last night?" asked Harold's mom. "Okay," Harold answered. Harold's answer didn't make any sense, but it was the best he could do under the circumstances. Before long, George and Harold were ready for school. They met up, as they did every school day, in George's front yard. "Are you ready for all our big tests today?" George asked droopily. "Pretty good," said Harold. He was so tired he couldn't even answer a simple question from his best friend correctly. How was he going to manage a day's worth of tests? "Let's get this over with," George moaned. "Wait," said Harold. I want to check on Cracker's eggs before we go to school. Harold wobbled to George's backyard and hoisted himself up the ladder to the treehouse. Hurry up, said George. Harold did not answer. Hey, shouted George, we're going to be late. Harold did not come down. George climbed up the steps and peeked inside the treehouse. It was just as he had expected. Harold had fallen asleep at their desk. Hey, Harold, said George, shaking his friend's shoulder. Wake up, man. We're going to be late for our tests. Just 5 minutes, moaned Harold. I just need to sleep 5 minutes, please. Well, okay, said George, but not a minute longer. George took his backpack off and set it against the treehouse door. Then he plopped down in his beanbag chair and looked at his pocket watch. 7:53 a.m. The second hand was ticking by awfully slowly. I'm just going to close my eyes for a second, said George, just for a few seconds. That afternoon, George yawned and stretched as he rolled over in his beanbag chair. He glanced at his pocket watch again. 4:41 p.m. George closed his eyes and went back to sleep. Suddenly, his eyes shot open. Oh, no! George screamed. Harold awoke with a jump. We fell asleep, George cried. We slept through school. We slept through our tests. We slept through everything. Oh, no, Harold wailed. We're dead, man. Game over. George and Harold peeked out their treehouse window. Harold's mom was out in her garden. She was whistling a cheerful tune. That's strange, said Harold. Why didn't the school call her and tell her we were absent? I have no idea, said George. George and Harold climbed down from the treehouse and walked over to the garden. How was school today? Asked Harold's mom. Oh, same as always, I guess, said Harold. He really was guessing. George's mom had heard them talking and came over. You didn't miss school today, did you? Asked George's mom. Nope, said George. Technically, George was telling the truth. He hadn't really missed school at all. Chapter 16. Super Secret Test Day. The next day, when George and Harold arrived at school, Mr. Krupp was overjoyed to see them. He met them at the front door, shook their hands enthusiastically, and gave them both big, sweaty hugs. This can't be good, George said. You're wrong, said Mr. Krupp. It's the best day ever. It's the day I've been waiting for since I met you two horrible people. Let's all go to my office, shall we? I've got refreshments. As they walked down the long hallway toward Mr. Krupp's office, several teachers patted Mr. Krupp on the back and congratulated him. The entire school staff seemed elated. We're doomed, said Harold. When they finally got to Mr. Krupp's office, he plopped down into his chair and spun around a few times, giggling with glee. After a few minutes, George started to become impatient. I thought you said there were going to be refreshments, George said. Not for you, shouted Mr. Krupp angrily as he slammed his fist on his desk. He opened his drawer, pulled out a warm diet soda, and popped it open. Then he leaned back in his chair and sipped loudly as he chuckled to himself. I just want to soak this moment in, he said with delight as fizzy brown phosphoric acid dribbled down his chins.
You boys have really messed up this time, Mr. Krupp laughed. You skipped school on Super Secret Test Day.
Super Secret Test Day? Said Harold. What does that mean?
I thought you'd never ask, Mr. Krupp said gleefully. You see, I've been looking for a way to separate you two kids for years now, but I never figured out how to do it until yesterday. Then it came to me in a flash of inspiration. Super Secret Test Day.
What's so secret about it? Asked George.
You should be asking, what's so super about it? Mr. Krupp joyfully. Because it might just be the crowning achievement of my entire career.
George and Harold looked at each other nervously. Suddenly the door opened and the school's math teacher, Miss Calculator, entered the room. She sneered down at George and Harold and poked her tongue out at them as she walked by. Here are the figures you asked for, she said, handing Mr. Krupp a large manila envelope.
Thanks, Anita, Mr. Krupp said.
He smelled the envelope like he was admiring the aroma of a gourmet meal.
It's a real shame you boys missed school yesterday, Mr. Krupp said. Your teachers hated to do it, but they had to give you both zeros on all of your tests.
But we studied really hard, said Harold. Can't we take makeup tests?
No, Mr. Krupp said, grinning evilly from ear to ear. There will be no makeup tests.
Don't worry, Harold, said George. We'll do really good on our final exams this year. We can bring our grades back up.
Final exams have been canceled for this year, said Mr. Krupp cheerfully. Isn't that wonderful news? You and all your classmates will get 7 more weeks of school with no homework, no quizzes, and no studying. Your grades for the whole school year have already been calculated.
Oh no, said George. We're going to flunk the 4th grade?
Actually, it's worse than that,
said Mr. Krupp, his teeth glistening in a grin so wide it seemed to stretch beyond the boundaries of his face.
Normally you wouldn't get this information until summer vacation begins, but I thought I'd be nice and show you your grades early. Isn't that fun?
He opened the manila envelope and slid 2 report cards toward George and Harold. Quickly the boys opened them up and scanned through them. George's final grade for the year was 62.7%. A terrible grade, to be sure, but still a passing grade. George would move on to 5th grade next year. Harold, whose grades were not quite as good as George's, wasn't so lucky. Harold's grade was 59.7%. Harold had failed. Oh no, Harold moaned as his eyes began to fill with tears. I'm going to flunk the 4th grade?
Yeah, ain't that too bad?
Said Mr. Krupp with a delighted twinkle in his eyes. He looked up at Miss Calculator, and they both burst into fits of laughter.
Ha 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 ha!
There's nothing you can do about it either, Miss Calculator sneered. You 2 brats will be in different grades next year. You'll never see each other in school anymore. You'll have different teachers, different classes, and different friends. Chapter 17. The Idea. I can't believe they're going to separate us, said Harold as the boys walked home from school that afternoon. George said nothing. He was thinking. He knew there had to be a way to solve this problem. I can't believe I have to spend an extra year at that school, too, Harold moaned, trying not to cry. The worst part is that I actually studied. I know this stuff. I could have probably gotten straight B's if I had taken those tests yesterday. "That's it!" cried George confidently. "We can fix this." "But how?" said Harold. "They won't let us take makeup tests." "Who says we have to take makeup tests?" George replied. "Let's take the real tests." Harold looked suspicious. "What do you mean?" he asked. "Melvin said he kept his time-traveling squid thingy in his garage, right?" said George. "Let's borrow it and go back in time to yesterday morning. Then we can take those tests like we were supposed to." Problem solved. "No way," Harold protested. "Whenever we travel around in time, bad stuff happens." "What could be worse than being in different grades next year?" George countered. "Do you really want to spend an extra year at that school?" Harold didn't have an argument for that. "Besides," said George, "we're only going back in time one day. How could anything bad happen in just one day?" "I guess you're right," said Harold. George and Harold turned around and headed over to Melvin's house. Luckily, Melvin's garage door was open. Cautiously, the two boys sneaked inside and looked around. And there, standing in the corner beside a box of Langstrom 7-inch gangly wrenches, was the glow-in-the-dark, time-traveling robo-squid suit. "We shouldn't be doing this," Harold whispered. "We're trespassing and stealing." "Hey, Melvin started this whole mess," George reminded Harold. "We're just fixing it. Besides, we're not stealing. We're just borrowing." Against his better judgment, Harold helped hoist George up into the cockpit. Suddenly, the robo-squid suit powered up and began to glow. A few moments later, the controls were all set. "Okay," said George. "Let's go back in time and take those dumb tests." He picked Harold up with one of his glowing tentacles, took a few steps forward, and pressed the start button. The glow-in-the-dark, time-traveling robo-squid suit began shaking and sputtering as it zipped backwards in time 32 hours. A blinding ball of light flashed suddenly, and George and Harold arrived bright and early yesterday morning, just in time for school. As Harold helped George climb out of the cockpit, he noticed there were now 2 glow-in-the-dark, time-traveling robo-squid suits. "Hey," said Harold, "how come there are 2 glow-in-the-dark, time-traveling robo-squid suits?" Said George. "I guess that one in the corner is the one from yesterday. When we went back in time, we created a duplicate time machine." "Oh," said Harold, "Melvin should thank us." "Yeah," said George, "that was very thoughtful of us." George and Harold ran back through town as fast as they could. Soon they were scrambling up the steps of Jerome Horowitz Elementary School. "This feels weird," said George. "I've never been so happy to go to school before." "Or to take tests," said Harold. And indeed, it was a happy school day for George and Harold. They took all their tests, did pretty well on most of them, and never had to deal with anything super or secret again. At least not until that afternoon. All right, we will pick up on Chapter 18 in the next video. Thank you for listening. Please subscribe to my channel and like this video. Thanks. Bye.